The Adventures of Squirrel Fluffytail, written by Dolores McKenna. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, on a beautiful island that stood in the center of a great big lake, there lived in the heart of a kindly old oak tree a dear little squirrel family. There were 3 in all, father, mother, and Fluffytail, and they were just the happiest family one could imagine. Father Squirrel worked hard all day long gathering nuts to store away so that they would all have enough food in the larder for winter. And when Mother Squirrel was not too busy doing her housework, she too helped to gather nuts, which she would tuck away in all sorts of places so that no lazy squirrels could find them. She knew that there were some lazy little rascals who would play all summer long, and that when the winter came, their poor babies would oftentimes cry because they were so hungry. Not that she would not help anyone in need, for she was a good, kind mother. But she knew from experience that those little squirrels who would not work and gather nuts when they were plentiful would help themselves to other folks' supply if they had a chance to do so. One day, while Mrs. Squirrel was ironing some pretty patties for Fluffytail, she heard a knock at the door. It was a messenger from Mrs. Squire Squirrel inviting Fluffytail to a surprise party to be given to her little daughter Furrikins. When Fluffytail came bouncing in to dinner that day and saw something pink peeping out from under her plate, you can just imagine how delighted she was when she pulled it out and found it was an invitation to a party, for parties were few and far between on the island. They had to be just after the summer visitors left the place, as it would not be very safe while they were there. With summer visitors, there was sure to be a boy with a gun who was always just so hungry for squirrel pot pie. In the winter, it was too cold, and in the spring, there was seldom enough food left for regular meals, much less a party. So now the time was just right, and Fluffytail thought she was never so happy in all her life. Chapter 2. After lunch on the day of the party, Mrs. Squirrel washed, brushed, and combed Fluffytail until it hurt. So she thought she would have to squeal once or twice. Then dressed her in one of the prettiest little party dresses one ever saw. Fluffytail even had new slippers with fluffy pink bows. "You must live up to your name, my dear," her mother said, as she tied her pretty pink bonnet strings. "And do, my dear," as she kissed her for at least the 20th time, "be very careful of your manners. Don't lose your present, the cutest lace-trimmed hanky with bluebirds in the corners. Go straight there and come straight back home before dark. You know, old Tabitha just loves little squirrels for dinner, and she wouldn't care even if you did have on your party dress. Cats are such prowling creatures sometimes," she added. Chapter 3. Mrs. Squirrel followed Fluffy a little way down the path, and at the corner Fluffy turned, waved goodbye with her little fan, and then was gone out of sight. Mrs. Squirrel sighed as she went back into the house, hoping all would be happy for her darling that day. Fluffy herself was surely happy, and after waving goodbye to her mother, her thoughts were filled with the good time and the good things she knew she would get to eat at the party. Her little brown eyes seemed to just dance whenever she would think of the pleasures in store for her. She had not gone very far along the road when she heard a wee voice crying, "Oh, please help me, it hurts so." And looking around, she saw a poor little mouse whose tail was caught between 2 stones. "Just a minute," said Fluffy, and after carefully putting down her hanky and fan, she tried to move the stones between which little Timmy Mouse's tail was caught. At first she thought she would not be able to, but at last she got a good-sized stick and raised the stone just enough for poor little Tim to get loose. He was so glad to be free, he said, not only because the stone hurt him dreadfully, but because he feared that old Mrs. Tabbycat was liable to be along any minute. I can't tell you how much I thank you, he said, but maybe someday I can do something for you. That's all right, said Fluffy, gathering up her things. Tell your mother to put some arnica on your tail and it won't hurt anymore. And she was gone out of the sight. I must hurry a little more, she thought, as I would hate dreadfully to be late for the party. Chapter 4. Oh dear me, what a narrow escape, exclaimed Fluffy as she stooped down and picked up a tiny little woodpecker that had fallen to the ground. Your mother must be very careless to let you fall. No, said the little chap. Mother has gone for food for us, and I played too near the edge of the stump and fell off. Just then the woodpecker's mother returned, and being alarmed that something was happening to her babies, came flying toward Fluffy, screaming, "What are you doing here?" I'm not harming your children, said Fluffy. I was just putting your little baby back in your nest. He has fallen to the ground and could not get up himself. It was lucky for him that I saw him when I did, for I almost stepped on him. By this time, Mrs. Woodpecker was over her alarm and was very sorry. She had spoken so crossly. Please forgive me, she said. I was so terribly frightened, I hardly knew what I was saying. I thank you 1,000 times. Should you ever need a friend, let me know, and I will do all I can to help you. Fluffy did not wait to talk longer. She knew it was getting nearer party time every minute, so she hurried on. Chapter 5. Now, thought Fluffytail, I shall not stop again, no matter what happens. I'll just hustle along and not stop until I reach Squire Squirrel's house. Why, it must be time for the party now, she thought, as she looked at her tiny little wristwatch. While looking at her watch, she heard a fluttering and rustling in the leaves along the roadside. I'll not stop, she thought. I'll just pretend I don't hear anything. She had only gone a few steps, though, when she had to turn back to see what was wrong. She was such a tender-hearted little creature. She could not go to a place where she knew she was to have a good time and feel that she might, by any chance, have passed by some suffering little person. What is it? She asked rather impatiently, as she glanced to where the noise seemed to come from. You needn't be so cross about it, said a little bat that was lying alongside the path. Won't you please pick me up and hang me on that old tree? I guess I must have fallen asleep and loosed my hold on that bark. No, not that way, he said, as Fluffy was trying to place him on the branch. Hang me upside down. That's the way I sleep. Very well, said Fluffy. There you are, upside down. Now I hope everything is all right. Yes, thank you, said Mr. Bat. I can go to sleep again now, and I'll try to be more careful. Before you go, though, he went on, I wish you would give me your name and address. I'll put it in my vest pocket, and maybe someday I'll be able to be of some use to you for your kindness in helping me out today. Fluffy told him in as few words as possible her name, where she lived, and where she was going. Then, bidding him goodbye, she picked up her packages and hurried along faster than ever. Chapter 6. Oh dear, she sighed. I might almost as well go home now. It's so late. I'm sure the ice cream and the cake and all the goodies will be eaten before I get there. I do wish people would not be so careless and make so much work for other people to do. I'm all tired out now, and I do hope that I've had my last delay. With this thought, she hurried along just as fast as her little feet would go. So excited was poor Fluffy now that she made a turn to the left instead to the right, and she had gone quite a distance before she discovered that there was something wrong. She did not know just what to do, and became so dreadfully frightened that she sat down and cried as though her little heart would break. How long she had been sitting there she could not tell. She went over the happenings since her dear mother kissed her goodbye, and wondered if she would be able to find her way back home without being caught by that awful old tabby cat. If ever I get out of this trouble, thought she, I'll never again stop any place to help anybody. If I had only gone straight to the party and let other folks take care of themselves, I would be safe now. With that thought, that she was now the most unhappy creature in the world, she burst into tears again. Won't you please give me those tears? Fluffy heard a tiny voice ask. I'm withering away and must die soon if somebody does not give me a tiny drink. Looking down, Fluffy saw a tiny little bluebell all wilted and looking so sad. The trees are so thick here, it said. I cannot get the rain or dew, and the fairies are having a big party today and have forgotten poor little me. By this time, Fluffy's tears were all dried up. Seeing someone in distress made her forget her own troubles. I can give you my tears, she said, for they have all dried now, but I can get you some water from the brook. So again, putting down her dear little fan and hanky, she skipped off to the brook to get the water. She had nothing in which to carry it, so she made a cup of her tiny hands and was stepping from one stone to another when her little foot slipped and splash into the water it went. Oh, my dear little shoe! Wailed Fluffy as she looked down and saw the pretty bow all wet and muddy. I can never go to the party now. She tried her best to wipe off the mud and fluff off the bow, and then got more water, which she took back to the little bluebell, who was eagerly waiting for her to return. There now, raise up your head and be happy, said Fluffy as she poured the water around its tiny roots. If you want more, I shall get it for you. Then I must try to find my way home, as I've lost my way to Furricane's party. By this time, the little bluebell was refreshed after its hearty drink and told Fluffy the way to reach Furricane's home. Chapter 7. Thanking the little flower, she again started out and was just making the last turn when who should she see in her path but old Tabby Cat. Fluffy looked, but for an instant she knew she must move quickly to escape. So she turned about, yelled for help as loudly as she could, and ran just as fast as her little legs would carry her. She was tired already after her long walk and could not make very good time. Old Tabby was gaining on her rapidly when Mrs. Woodpecker, who had heard Fluffy's first cry for help, flew at once to the rescue. She jumped on Mrs. Tabby's head and began pecking for all she was worth. This was such a surprise to old Tabby that she fell head over heels into a hole by the roadside, and it was quite a few minutes before she recovered herself enough to peep out to try to discover just what had attacked her. As she did so, a big stone dropped from some place down in the hole beside her, pinning her tail fast. It was some time before little Timmy Mouse, for it was he who had rolled the stone on old Tabby's tail, dared to look over the edge of the pit to see how well his plan worked. So it was you, said Tabby, glaring at Timmy. One look was enough for little Timmy, and she scurried off home as fast as he could go. Chapter 8. By this time it was quite late, and poor little Fluffy was still running, thankful to have escaped old Tabby, but fearful of some new danger at every step. Suddenly a voice beside her said, "Don't be frightened. Follow close to me, for I can see quite well in the dark. You did me a good turn once in the daylight, and now I can help you in the dark." With these words, Mr. Bat, for it was the same one she had helped that afternoon, when he had fallen from the tree, took hold of her hand and led her to the Furrikins' home, where they were all waiting to greet her. After Mrs. Woodpecker had jumped on Mrs. Tabby, she flew on to tell the little folks at the party all about poor Fluffy's experience and to ask them to keep the party waiting just a little longer. Chapter 9. It was surely a grand party. They had it on their beautiful lawn, and the moon had come out so brightly that the little folks played all their games they had arranged for the daytime. There were nuts, apples, candies, and all sorts of goodies to eat, nice games to play, and they danced around in the moonlight till the whip-poor-will called, which was the curfew for all. As it was so late when Fluffy arrived at the party, Mrs. Furrikins sent a message to her mother telling her that she would keep her all night and send her home early next morning. So after the party was over and all the little folk had gone to their homes in the woods, Mrs. Squirrel tucked Fluffy and Furrikins in her daughter's little bed, kissed each of them good night, heard them say their prayers, and went quietly to her own room on the opposite side of the big oak tree. Chapter 10. Fluffy was too tired to dream of the many experiences she had had that day and went to sleep quickly. Early next morning, as promised, Mrs. Furrikins saw to it that Fluffy was taken safely home. Her mother was anxiously waiting for her at the door, and each was happy to feel the other's arm around her. Mother Squirrel kissed her little daughter after each adventure was told to her, and wiping the tears from her eyes when Fluffy had finished, she said, "After all, Fluffy dear, you see that one can never lose anything by being kind to others. You are home again, safe and sound, and I'm glad you enjoyed the party." The end.